Let's start by considering the firm's production function. Specifically, we're going to consider the short run, which, remember, simply means that some factors of production are fixed. Remember, we typically assume that capital inputs are fixed, meaning machinery, buildings, and so on, and that labor, so workers, are more flexible in the short run. So under this assumption, short-run production will depend only on labor because that's the one input that can change. We said that we can often expect the total product function, so the function that tells us how output varies with the number of workers, to display initially a increasing rate, and then after that we can expect it to eventually start to increase at a slower and slower rate. What does this mean? It means that the marginal product, so how much does each extra worker add to output, is often increasing as the firm hires more workers because they're able to specialize and learn. And so hiring 10 workers, they may be more productive per worker than hiring a single worker who then has to do too many different tasks. So we can expect there to be initial gains from specialization. However, eventually, given that some factors of production are fixed, as you add more workers, they're able to add less and less to extra output, and so we can expect there to be diminishing marginal returns. So when the slope is getting steeper, that means that the marginal product of labor is increasing. When the slope is getting flatter, that means that the marginal product of labor is decreasing. So there will be an initial portion where you have increasing marginal product of labor up until some level of labor, which we can mark L0 just for reference, after which marginal product of labor will be decreasing, meaning that total product is going to increase at a slower rate. And so at that point, let's mark output there as Q0, Q0. That way, we'll be able to think about how marginal cost evolves with output. If we think this pattern holds for total product, in other words, if we think that as you're adding workers, at the margin they increase output by more and more originally and then by less and less after a certain point, that has direct implications for the firm's costs. Okay? Let's say that the first worker produces 1 unit of output. Then the second worker increases total product by more than 1 unit, let's say by 2. Okay? That means that to produce the first unit of output, you had to pay the wages of that one worker. To produce the next 2, you had to pay the wages of the second worker. So per unit, the second and third units were cheaper to make than the first. And so your costs, as you're trying to increase production, will increase initially at the slower and slower rate. So your marginal costs will decrease, and then at a faster and faster rate once we pass this threshold. Now, what cost is this? This is the cost of workers. We said that in the short run, some factors of production are fixed and some are variable. Well, if labor is the variable factor, then this is the cost we just graphed. So variable cost, which in this case is simply the wage times the number of workers. Okay, and the point of inflection, the point where the slope changes from decreasing to increasing, would be somewhere around here. By the way, this doesn't have to be horizontal here. It's probably not going to be horizontal. that will be the Q0 level of output we've marked here. And the cost of workers at that level will be the wage times the level of labor we've indicated over here. So this pattern where we have initial specialization followed by diminishing marginal returns translates into a situation where marginal cost is initially decreasing, so variable cost increases slower and slower, and then marginal cost is increasing, meaning that variable cost increases faster and faster. Now, variable cost is not the firm's only cost, so for in the short run, some factors of production are fixed. The cost of those is then by definition not going to vary with Q. That cost will simply be a straight line. Let's say that it tracks here. Then the total cost will simply be the sum of variable and fixed costs, so it will be the variable cost curve shifted up. Then marginal cost is the rate of increase in total cost, equivalently the rate of increase in variable cost. So as you produce one more unit of output, how much does total cost increase, which is the same as saying how much does variable cost increase. So just as we could read marginal product on this graph as the slope of the total product, we can read marginal cost on this graph as the slope of either the variable cost curve or the total cost curve. Next, what we're going to do is graph the per unit cost, so marginal cost as well as average cost that we'll define momentarily, and we'll see how that helps us derive the firm's supply curve under the assumptions of perfect competition. Here, what we're seeing is marginal cost starts off at the relatively high level. The curve is relatively steep here, then decreases up until Q0. At Q0, it's at its lowest level. This is where the curve is flattest, and then it becomes steeper again, so MC increases. So we could graph marginal cost something like this, where this point of minimum is Q0 from that graph. It's not a particularly meaningful point beyond this, but I've graphed it just to establish the connection. Just as we had defined marginal cost here as measuring the increase in total or alternatively variable cost as output increases, we also define average cost. So we have average variable cost, literally the variable cost divided by the number of units of output, average total cost divided by the units of output, and average fixed cost. Let's examine them in turn. Average variable cost is capturing the cost of labor per unit on average up to some level of production. That's going to be closely related to marginal cost, because marginal cost, remember, is measuring the increase in variable cost. So that is also a measure of the cost of the variable input as we produce more units. So whenever we have diminishing marginal cost, that means that as you produce more and more units of output, the cost of the additional ones decreases more and more, and the average costs of labor for producing output are also going to decrease. So we can expect that average variable cost starts at the same level as marginal cost, and it also decreases if marginal cost decreases, but it's going to decrease at a slower rate because it's capturing the costs per unit of output of not just the current unit, but all of the previous ones as well. And it will keep decreasing as long as marginal cost is lower than the current average. Once these two curves intersect, average variable cost will start to increase as well. So this point of intersection is where average variable cost is minimized. Initially, the average fixed cost will be very high because we're dividing a constant by a very small amount q, after which, as q increases, this will go to 0, not exactly to 0, but it will become very small, and as that happens, average total cost will get closer and closer to the average variable cost curve. Now remember that we could think of marginal cost as not just the change in variable cost, but also as the change at the margin and total cost. And so that is also why average total cost is going to decrease as long as marginal cost is below it, and it's going to increase once we're past the intersection, and once at the margin producing extra units, it costs more than the average of all the units before.